We are chatting with the man, the legend, pseudo Matt Swaim, and we're talking about priests and pastors, the difference of it between the two. Actually, Matt, here's a good question. How do denominations understand the idea of clergy differently, or do they all pretty much have the same idea of what a Protestant pastor ought to be?
Well, they definitely don't have all the same idea, that's for sure, because some of them are ordained by the laying on of hands. Some of them just ascend into leadership. Some people have to go to seminary and get a master's of divinity and be appointed by a denomination. Some people can just say, you know what, God told me that I needed to be a preacher, and then they're a preacher the next day. There's a huge variety, and this is why, when it comes to ecumenical dialogue, the Catholic Church is in different kind of levels of dialogue depending on who it is that they're talking to. Like we have one kind of level with the Orthodox because they have an understanding of the priesthood and the sacraments that is nearly identical to ours. We have a different level with the Anglicans because they have a sense of priesthood and sacraments that looks very similar but is essentially very different than ours. And Lutherans, very similarly. But then everybody else, I mean, it's a grab bag. You can't just you can't have the same kind of ecumenical discussions with a Pentecostal that you can have with someone who's Orthodox, because Pentecostals it may be that someone just was filled with the Holy Spirit and said, I'm called to be the pastor of this place, and then it's their church, as opposed to the Orthodox, who the laying on the hands and apostolic succession. So, yeah, it's a very different thing depending on where you're going. And in this age where Christianity, especially evangelical Christianity, is much less denominational than it ever was, then sometimes it can be hard to trace. I mean, I've met people who've been pastors of congregations for 20 years and never been to a lick of grad school, right? Some of them haven't even finished college. It's just, at least some of the ones I met in Kentucky hadn't. It wasn't seen as necessary. But others, good luck getting a pastorate in the Lutheran Church if you don't have some letters behind your name that you worked for.
Yeah. So it could be like a trade, or it could be, white collar, blue collar. It all depends, depending on what perspective you're coming from.
Yeah, same with a diaconate, depending on denominations, by the way.
Yeah.
Some people have like rotating diaconates, where you serve like a 2 or 3 year term as a deacon. And I met this lady at the YMCA, and we were hanging out in like one of the chill areas after a workout and got talking. She was a Lutheran deaconess. I don't even think that this was necessarily how our denomination did it, but this is how our congregation did it, that she served a 2 year term, and she was in charge of the people whose last names went from S through Z. So as a deacon, she was assigned that part of the alphabetical mailing list to kind of check up on. But her term, would eventually end. It's not like, there's nothing like in the Catholic priesthood. I mean, there are probably denominations that think of it this way, but I've yet to encounter them articulating it the same way. Like that a Catholic priest is a priest forever. They're a sign of like this eschatological reality of what we will all be in the beatific vision. And so he may be a terrible priest. He may have done horrible things. He may be in jail, but he's still a priest. He may not be allowed by his bishop to confect the sacraments, but there's like an indelible mark that was made on his character. He may have been defrocked, as the media likes to call it, but there's like this essential change that happened to him at ordination that is an eternal change. And I don't know that I ever heard it talked about that way in any of my denominations when it came to clergy. But again, I think we take for granted what the word priest implies. It implies sacrifice is part of the job. And that's what is implied in every generation, whether you're, a Baal worshiper or, any kind of pagan, or whether you're a Catholic, or whether you're Orthodox or Anglican. There's an implication that sacrifice is part of the job. That's what the priesthood was established for in Judaism, is to preside over sacrifice. And you take the sacrifice out of your worship, then what's going on up there is not a priestly act. So in a Protestant church, there is no sacrifice at the corner of all of this that's tying the whole worship service together. There may be talk of, laying down your burdens at the foot of the cross, and maybe talking about turning over your life to Jesus. But even in that, it's not like the sense that you're fulfilling in a very concrete sense a form of sacrifice. The way that we are every time we go and receive the Eucharist that is confected on an altar. That's the whole point of an altar. An altar is not just a nice table to hold the book so the priest can hold up his hands and read the right prayers. It's like a place where things die. Like that's what an altar is.
Yeah, 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 very good. Yeah, and oddly enough, even though the idea of sacrifice is outrightly denied, dogmatically in Protestantism, there still are altars, quote unquote.
Yeah.
You know.
What's funny is that so we would have the altar call, depending on, sometimes it would be a revival service and come down to the altar and give your life to Christ. And very often there was not an altar on the stage in the sanctuary, but there would be like rails that you'd kneel. And so the impression I always had was that the altar was like those rails in the front where you knelt. And in a sense, for
really?
Protestantism, when you're, if that's where you're going and offering your heart to God, then it makes sense to call that, an altar of sorts. But visually, it looks to us like the altar rail. Now, occasionally you'd have, a communion table brought out for the Lord's Supper in some of the congregations I was part of. But there wasn't this sense that no matter what else happens here, we're going to do a sacrifice today. The way that there is in the Catholic faith. I mean, even if you go to a weekday mass and the pastor just reads the gospel, sits down, stands up and says, all right, time for the petitions. He may not preach anything, but no matter what, there's going to be the tapping into the one holy sacrifice of the mass. If you're a Catholic and you go somewhere else, to another service, it's the first thing that you notice that's like missing, right? When you go to a Protestant church, it's the first thing that you're like, well, we're not